Really excited to have you all here for the Rose Foundation's 2024 Grassroots Convening, Power to the People, Strengthening Grassroots Advocacy. My name's Aurora, and I'm the Program Officer for our Grassroots Grant Making here at the Rose Foundation. And we're super excited to bring you this series on strategies to build your advocacy skills. Today's session is all about lobbying and elections and what C3s can do and cannot do, and the role of grassroots nonprofits in our democracy. Something that I'm sure has been top of mind for a lot of you, especially to get closer and closer to November. This is going to be the first of 3 sessions. We're going to be here for the next couple of Fridays, exploring different themes around how to engage with decision makers, how to build community support for your cause, and how to gain media attention to amplify the work that you're doing. We really hope that you'll join us for the upcoming workshops as well. They're going to be really cool. And please feel free to invite your colleagues, your board members, your community partners. We'd love to have them. I won't take too much more time. I just want to introduce Matt, who is our trainer for today. Matt is the Deputy Campaign Director at California Environmental Voters. He's a longtime organizer, and he's here to help us walk through the ins and outs of what you can do to engage in policymaking. So Matt, we're super grateful to have you here. And thanks to all of you for spending your time with us today. I'll turn it over to you, Matt, to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aurora. It's so great to be here with everybody today. If you don't remember me, a couple years ago, also did a series of trainings for the same convening. So excited to be with some of you again. But like Aurora said, today is all about figuring out what are the capabilities, capacities, and abilities that you as a C3 grassroots organization can do. Oftentimes, we are working from a C3 point of view or at a C3 organization, and we're told, oh, there's so much limitations to what we can do with regard to advocacy, to what we can do with regard to engaging with voters or elections, to what we could do to talk about policy. But oftentimes what I've found is that people don't recognize or realize there's so much more you can actually do that is permissible and safe within a C3 compliance than what you can't do, right? And there are clear lines, and what my goal for today is to help you have a better understanding and sense of what that is. Just to introduce myself a little bit more, Matt Abularch Macias, he, him, ed pronouns, and I'm the Deputy Campaigns Director at California Environmental Voters. I've been at California Environmental Voters for 9 years. So I'm become very familiar with how to distinguish between C3, C4, and PAC activities. And that's because California Environmental Voters exists as 3 entities. We are a C4 organization, we are a C3 organization, our education fund, but we also have PAC entities that we manage because we engage in partisan elections where we support candidates. And today, just want to give a caveat or a preface that I am not a lawyer. So everything I share with you today is based off of guidance that I've received from lawyers over the last 9 years, navigating the complications of 3 different kinds of entities as viewed by the IRS and the state. And so my biggest piece of advice for you is if you ever have any legal questions, speak to a lawyer first and foremost, either an IRS lawyer or a C3, C4 organizational lawyer, because that is going to be the person you want to get your most sound advice from, a formal advice from. But what I can provide, like I said, is information that I've received in memos from lawyers, information that I know as fact because of my experience working on these issues. So just want to give that preface that I am no way giving you legal guidance, but helping you understand how to navigate and know what questions to ask when you are going to a lawyer. But hopefully after today, you'll have a better sense of what are the questions you should be asking or what are the places that you need to know. Really, today, we just want to empower you to make sure that what you're doing is legally compliable and that you are keeping you, yourself and your organization safe. And also exploring what possibilities may exist for your organization, should you feel that those are the right tactics and strategies you want to employ with them. So we're going to play a little game to start us off as we get into some of the content. And the game is called, is it a C3 or is it a C4? So I'm going to pose a question to you all. And my ask is going to be that you raise your hand and using the raise hand function, and whoever raises their hands, I'll call on the first person I see and we'll have them answer, probably give a little bit of explanation if the answer is correct or not correct, or we'll see what we can get to. All right, so let's start off with the first question. And the first question is, educating community members about important issues. Is this a C3 activity or a C4 activity? All right, I see Janet's hand first. Janet, what do you think?
C3.
And Janet, you are correct. Doing education in the community on important issues, relevant, as so long as you are not advocating on behalf of the issue, and it is a C3 permissible activity. One thing I'm going to say note as a caveat here is C4s are also allowed to do community education, right? So anything a C3 can do, a C4 will be able to do. But for the purposes of you all being C3 entities, I'll just keep it as, yep, this is a C3 activity. All right, thank you, Janet. Question number 2. Meeting with policymakers or legislators to inform them about problems in your community. So if you meet with a legislator, is that C3 or C4? All right, Rosalind.
I think it's C3 if it's just informational.
Why do you think so?
Because it's providing context and information for legislators to have information about things that they're voting about or creating policy about. So
Yeah.
it could be provided just as a not pushing one way or the other. But
Yeah.
depends what you say. I guess depends what you ask for.
Yes. As a C3 organization, you have unlimited capacity to talk to the policymakers and legislators about issues in your community, things that they should know about, as long as you're not advocating for a specific policy or expressing a desire for them to take action on a specific policy. If it's informational, research you're providing to them, all of that is C3 permissible. Also, for the interpretation, if I start talking too fast, please let me know. I know I need to slow down a little bit. All right. Number 3, knocking on doors to educate voters about problems in their community. Is this C3 or C4? Raise your hand if you want to take a guess. Oops.
C4, sorry.
Fausia, a C4 you said.
That's what I was
I
saying.
think it's a little bit of both, but I don't know. I see a lot of
Actually,
C4s.
yeah, so C4 you think? All right, actually this is C3 permissible.
Oh, cool.
Yes, you can go talk to voters, do, knocking on doors, make phone calls, just to do education. As long as you're not expressing any advocacy for them to lobby them on a specific issue or policy you want them to take action on, or you're not expressing or are advocating for them to vote in a certain way, then that is completely C3 permissible. And we'll talk a little bit more about the legalities there. Rosalind, I see you have a hand. Do you have a response to this? Yes.
Oh, I'm just curious, what is it? Does having gear that says one thing differently than what you're communicating with your words, does that count as advocacy? Or
Yes.
it's permissible?
Yeah, if you are having something, if you're wearing something that's like, oh, vote for X candidate, and you're just, oh, but I'm here to talk to you about this, that would, I think, wouldn't fly the legal standard, because you're showing up and there's something being communicated, whether it be verbal or visual. Awesome. All right, number 4. Telling a policymaker how you want them to vote on a specific policy issue. Is it C3 or C4? Anyone want to take a stab?
C4.
And Janet, I see your hand. Go for it.
C4.
C4. So Janet, you're correct in that C4s have unlimited ability to do this. C4s can lobby to an unlimited amount. However, as I've alluded to earlier, C3s are also allowed to lobby.
Can't,
just-
because in our state, I think we can lobby on issues. We can't lobby on candidates.
Yes, and I would distinguish candidates as electioneering, whereas lobbying is about policy and issues. So for the purposes of the training today, we'll use that language. Where if I'm talking about electioneering, that would be in reference to candidates. And if I'm saying lobbying, it's in reference to policies and issues. And so C3s do have an ability to lobby, like I said before, to a limited capacity, depending on your organizational budget size and the way that you are incorporated. But that is something that we'll get to a little bit more. Number 5, knocking on doors, making phone calls, or sharing on social media who to vote for in the election. Then we want to raise our hand, take a stab at it. Janet, do we want to give someone else a try real quick?
Sure.
All right, Cindy.
C4.
Yes, this is explicitly C4. C3s cannot do this at all, And this is a clear line. This is C4s. C4s, however, also have a limitation here. C4s can't do this to an unlimited amount. It has to remain under their primary purpose, right? So less than 50% of what the activities they do. But there's also another kind of entity called political action committees or PACs, and they can do this kind of work or activity to an unlimited amount. All right, moving on to number 6. Knocking on doors, making phone calls, or posting on social media, telling people or telling voters to make sure they vote in the election. Is this C3, C4? Anybody want to raise your hand? Try it. Yolanda.
Both of them can do it. As long as the C3 is not endorsing the candidate, you can do civic engagement.
Exactly. As long as you are not expressing a partisan preference for a certain political party, or you're not expressing a preference for a candidate or advocating for somebody to vote in a certain direction, but you're explicitly just educating voters on the importance of voting or making sure that they turn out to vote, completely C3 permissible, and something you can do. Oftentimes, one of the challenges historically is that people aren't turning out to vote. And we know that when more people vote, we tend to get better leadership, stronger democracy. And so for those reasons, and also there have been groups and groups within our communities that have historically been marginalized and or lack access to voting. And so supporting the ability for those groups who have been historically disenfranchised to vote is something that's completely permissible as a C3. But, one caveat I want to add here, though, is before you do any kind of civic engagement program, I highly recommend talking to an elections lawyer to confirm that your messaging, that your script is C3, qualifies as C3 language. 7, telling voters how to vote on a ballot measure or a proposition. So in California, so this might not be true in every state, but in California, we have statewide ballot measures, which are, or we call them propositions, right? Where it's a policy that's going to be on the ballot that everybody in the state votes for, or you might have a local ballot measure as well, something that's related just to your county or your city. Is this C3 or C4? April.
C4.
So April, you are correct that C4s can do this and primarily should be done from a C4 potentially. But also C3s actually can do this as well and can engage in ballot measure advocacy. And here's the reason. Ballot measures are considered policy. So it's not electing a candidate, but it's voting on a policy. And then the policymakers then are the voters. So then your activity to advocate for a ballot measure is considered lobbying because voters are the policymakers. So you're lobbying them to vote one way or the other on this policy. And so you would still fall under the limitations of lobbying for your organization, but C3s do have the ability to engage in ballot measure advocacy. However, a safer way that C3s can also ensure that people know what's on their ballot is just pure education, which is completely, you can do to an unlimited capacity. Know that this ballot measure is on your ballot. This is what it does. These are the pros and cons. And an unbiased sharing of information of that ballot measure is also completely C3 permissible. So that one was a little bit of a trick question, but an important distinction for you all to know, because sometimes there are local ballot measures or state ballot measures that have an impact on the work that you're doing. All right, well, that was our questions.
Man,
Yes, sorry, go
Can you
back.
explain the example again? You said that when you're advocating for the ballot measures, you
Mhm.
can explain it like this is what it means and how it affects you.
Yeah, that wouldn't be advocating. That would just be education, right? So you can educate on the ballot measure to an unlimited degree. It's really just sharing people. This is on your ballot and this is what it does. You're not telling people support this. You're not telling people to vote against it. You're merely sharing what's on the ballot and what's in the ballot measure, what the policy does.
So can a C3, since you said that because it's considered like policy,
Yes,
can
exactly.
you encourage your as community members or some supporters to vote in a certain way?
You can, as a
Okay.
C3 for ballot measures. As a C3, you can, again, you fall under the limits of lobbying that your organization has. So whatever limit that is, whether it be the certain like dollar amount of your budget that's allowed to go to that, or depending on where your funding sources are coming from, which funding sources you have that allow you to use those dollars for lobbying activities.
So this will be considered lobbying.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's not electioneering.
Okay.
I could give one example of something we're doing right now, actually. We are creating materials to share information around Proposition 4 in California, which is a bond that's going to fund investments in climate action, investments for public lands, investments for fighting extreme wildfires, et cetera. There's a lot. It's a $10 billion bond, and there's a lot in there. And there's two ways we are approaching this. We are working with a coalition called the Power and Nature Coalition, which some of you might be a part of. And we're going to create content and materials that's purely educational. This is what's in the bond. This is how much dollars are going to go to this. This is how much dollar goes to this, right? That all C3s will be able to engage with and share. But we're also going to create some materials that's vote yes on Proposition 4, the ballot, the climate bond. And when we're expressing that would then we be advocating for somebody. And again, us as a C3, we have the ability to lobby and we have the resources to be able to do that. So we feel comfortable sharing that kind of information. Another C3 organization might not feel comfortable sharing that vote yes on Prop 4 kind of content, right? Because they don't have the resources and or dollars to be able to do that. But we do have that capacity. Again, you just have to check with your own organization's ability to do so. But like I said, the other side is you can still do education around what's on the ballot measure. Rosalind, is that a new question?
Yeah, how does staffing time account in the percentage you were referring to.
Yeah, that's so any staff time that's dedicated to that lobbying is what you have to count towards those lobbying dollars. So that would be like, so for example, say you had $100,000 budget and you have to keep under 15% of your budget to lobbying. So you have about $15,000 worth of staff time and or activities that you can use towards lobbying. April, is that a new question?
Nope, sounds good.
Cool. All right. Oh,
Matt, I
sorry,
just
so
want to,
Katie?
yeah, I just
Yeah.
want to acknowledge we have one more in the chat here.
Thank you. It's my view, I can't really see the chat, so if you can help me out with that, that'd be fantastic.
Sure. So the question is, in regards to 501c3, what if you don't state a vote no or yes? However, make statements about how such a ballot measure or proposition affects your community.
It depends what you mean by effects. If effects means like there's $100 million that will come to parks in our community, that's an effect on your community, but you're not expressing a bias if it's a positive effect or negative effect. You're just sharing what the effect is. That's completely fine. But if you're saying it's $100 million for parks in our community, and we really want to see this happen, or this is going to be really good for our community, then you're advocating or expressing a bias for support for that bond, right? So something for that ballot measure. So that is where I would say the distinction is. All right. Next, I want to go into a little bit of defining what a C3 is versus what a C4 is and the legal A's on those. I put some bullet points here, but you're actually going to hear me read from some notes that I have, which are directly from our lawyers to make sure that I am accurately reflecting and representing the legalities here. So a 501c3 organization, which all of you are familiar with, right, must spend its funds for charitable, scientific, or educational purposes, and it cannot use its funds for the benefit of any private individual or group of individuals. In addition to this, a 501c3 is strictly prohibited from participating or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of any candidate for public office, and may only use an insubstantial part of the charity's expenditures for lobbying activities, which we've talked about. One distinction here is any contribution to a 501c3 is tax deductible. And the reason for that is, in theory, 501c3s have a tax exempt status because they're providing a public good, public education. And so the government considers that provides the tax exemption because it's a public good. And so there's public benefit to it. Now we're going to go to a 501c4, and a 501c4 has a lot less restrictions than a 501c3. Fewer limitations for the use of its funds. The main requirement is that a 501c4 is that its primary purpose must be to promote the social welfare. So there is still a public social welfare element to 501c4s, but it's not. But you can have more, I guess, bias or interpretation to what that means. This includes publicly advocating for positions on policy issues. For example, by producing and disseminating advertising, lobbying for legislation consistent with these positions, and working on the passage or defeat of ballot measures. In addition, as with the 501c3 organization, a 501c4 organization may not be operated primarily to benefit private individuals or a group of individuals, such as a specific political party. 501c4 organizations may engage in unlimited lobbying activity and may engage in some candidate electioneering, so long as it doesn't supplant the organization's primary purpose, keeping it under 50% of its activities. What I would share here is that there are some elements of, hold on, let me just see what my next slide is, just to make sure I'm going, yeah, all right, cool. There are some elements of lobbying and electioneering that 501c3s are allowed to do and not allowed to do. And so I'm gonna, in the next slides, kind of go over those in a little bit more detail. We've already talked about some of them. I've referred to some of them in the game we're playing right now, but just wanna, we'll go into them more details. But before we move on, does anybody have any questions on the distinction between a 501c3 or a 501c4? All right, no questions. All right, next we're gonna go into understanding lobbying as a C3. And just give me 1 second to get some water. Are you all still seeing the presentation full screen or is it half screen?
Oh,
It's
now,
screen
now
now.
we can see it. Now we can see it full screen.
Okay. Okay, hold on 1 second. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my notes so I can see my notes as well. Apologies.
Matt, would you like me to share
There was also
presentation?
a spot right there that presenter view when you click to present.
Yeah, I think I might need to do that. Because I want to read my notes, but I don't know how I did it before. This is so fun. I'm so sorry, y'all. That's not working.
That looks good to
There you
me.
go. I got it. I got it, y'all. All right, are y'all seeing presenter view or slideshow view?
Oh, I see the slideshow. It's good for me.
Oh, awesome. All right, so you see this lobbying at C3.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Whew, stressed me out a second. All right, so lobbying as a C3. So C3s can only engage in insubstantial amounts of lobbying, which is defined as attempts to influence legislation. And generally, lobbying consists of communications that are intended to influence specific legislation. One thing I want to say is, like, if you're just talking about an issue, for example, I'm from Rancho Cucamonga, California originally, and in the Inland Empire, San Bernardino, Riverside counties, there is a big issue with the expansion of warehouses, because they bring a lot of pollution to our communities. And if I go to my legislators and I say, hey, warehousing has caused a lot of problems in our communities. We've seen increased rates of asthma. We've seen our roads deteriorate. We need to do something about this. And there's no policy that I'm recommending. There's no policy position or policy that they're currently looking at in the legislature that is dealing with warehouses. I'm just sharing my experience and story with the legislator. And then that's not considered lobbying, right? There's not specific legislation involved here. But this last year, there was a warehouse policy that the California legislature was exploring about creating buffer zones between warehouses and houses and schools. And so if I were to go to my legislator and say, hey, I want you to do something about warehousing, or this is the problems that I'm facing, because there's specific legislation that they're currently deciding on or voting on, then that would be considered lobbying. So there's two basic types of lobbying, right? Direct lobbying, that is lobbying directly with communication with a legislator, a staffer, or another governmental employee who participates in the formulation of legislation. That there's also grassroots lobbying, and grassroots lobbying consists of a communication that's an attempt to encourage the public, so contacting constituents of a legislator or of a city council member, to tell them to call their legislator or city council member to take a position on a specific legislation or expresses a view on that legislation. As I mentioned before, expenses associated with a ballot measure campaign are considered direct lobbying because the voter is acting as a legislator. So if you're contacting voters, that's direct lobbying. It wouldn't be grassroots lobbying. However, if there's a policy that your state assembly member or state house member, I think some states have it called it, is voting on, and you call voters to then tell them to call their state assembly member or state house member, then that would be grassroots lobbying. It gets a little tricky, but just want to make sure there's a distinction there. And so there's something called the 501H election, where your organization elects to sign a paper saying, okay, we will only lobby to the certain limit capacity. And I want to say it's like 15% of your organizational budget, or under 15% is dedicated to that. It might be a little bit higher, but that, to be safe, I think people try to keep it under 15%. Other things in terms of lobbying, I just want to make sure. Oh, now I want to talk a little bit about what's not lobbying, or what's exempted from the definition of lobbying. So as we mentioned before, it was the first question on the game. Educating the public about broad social, economic, or similar problems, as long as the organization doesn't refer to specific or anticipated legislation, it's not lobbying. Legal action brought in the courts, it's not lobbying. Attempts to influence the actions of administrative bodies. And this is something that I would say check with your state. But for example, in California, we have state agencies that do policymaking or rulemaking that has an impact on us. And we can talk to those agencies and about the rulemaking that they're doing, and that is not considered lobbying, because they're usually implementing something that's already passed as law. So now we're just talking about how it gets implemented. But check with your state, because certain agencies like utility boards might be considered a policymaker or a legislator. And so that is something you want to check with the specific rules in your state. But in California, it's not. What also is not lobbying is providing technical assistance to a governmental body, provided that the governmental body specifically requests that assistance in writing. So if you're working with the state, they say, hey, you're an expert on this issue with the rivers in this part of the state. Can you provide us some expertise on how we should be implementing or thinking about implementing a program there, right? That kind of technical assistance, that expertise would not be considered lobbying. Yes, you're working with maybe a legislator, maybe you're working with the state government, but it's not lobbying. And also, nonpartisan analysis of a policy or the pros and cons. So it has to be unbiased, right? So basically, I know many of you might have seen like a fact sheet of a certain bill or policy that's making its way through the legislature. If you just say, hey, this is what this bill would do, or this piece of legislation would do, these are the pros, these are the cons, and as long as it's balanced for both sides, then that is not considered lobbying. So all that, right, there, like I said, as a C3, you do have a capacity and ability to lobby. I shared with you what kinds of lobbying there is, and also shared with you what's not considered lobbying. However, the caveat that I gave before is sometimes we receive funds that explicitly state these are not to be used for the intent or purpose of advocacy or lobbying based on where you get that money from. There's some funders or grants or dollars that doesn't have that limitation. But if you're getting a government grant, most definitely it's probably has that explicitly in there, right? Some foundations, again, they have different rules based on their sources of funding. So just wanted to make sure that you also know it's not just these are not just the legal rules, but also you might have rules regarding where your resources are actually coming from. Any questions?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. For when you
how much of like the prep work would be considered lobbying, right? So like create the creation of the materials or like, I don't know if you plan to get into more of those specifics later, but how do you like make sure you're accounting for the right amount of time when you're tracking how much lobbying you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, you have a lot more wiggle room than what you think. Preparation of materials is not considered lobbying. It's considered support for either direct lobbying if you're talking directly to a legislator, or support for grassroots lobbying if it's creating materials that you're going to use to tell constituents or voters to contact their legislator, right? That's not the hard lobbying is when you're actually expressing or advocating or making that ask of that legislator or of that constituent or voter to make that ask of their legislator. Otherwise, it's considered support for lobbying. And also check with your state, whoever oversees lobbying reporting on what you actually have to report or not report. Cindy.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify what you said about the percentage of organizational budget. Was it 15% of your budget can be used for lobbying? Did I understand that right?
From my memory, yes. I have to go back and confirm that. And apologies, I should have had that number at the top of my at the top of these notes. But from my memory, the 501H election is 15%.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Next, we're going to talk about. All right, well, let's see. If it lets me, there we go. Elections as a C3. So what you can do in elections or civic engagement as a C3. Brahmi, I saw your hand. I'm so sorry. Did you have another question with regards to lobbying?
I just wanted to clarify on that 15%, or I get some clarity, because I was actually just looking into this earlier, and I thought it depended on the size of your organization. Like, so for my organization, our limit is 5% according to the 501H. So I just wanted to clarify, is that accurate?
That's a good question.
I mean, that's what I'm finding.
Yeah, Brahmi, I think you're right.
I think you're right. Yeah.
If your organization has elected to track your lobbying through the 501, what is it, CH, it is based on the size of the organization. I just threw something into the chat. Sorry for the horrendously long link, but it kind of goes based on the overall budget of the organization. You can see there's a chart.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Perfect. Great question. And thank you for clarifying that. And thank you, Aurora, for finding that link. All right. Elections or engaging in civic engagement activities or elections as a 501c3. As I said before, 501c3s cannot attempt to influence any candidate elections. There's so many types of activities that do or do not constitute intervention in candidate elections. But it's important to keep in mind that this restriction is broader than just a prohibition on express advocacy or its functional equivalent, meaning many activities that may not be considered reportable political activity under campaign finance law still constitute unlawful interventions in campaigns if undertaken by a charity. For example, one thing that we have as an organization is we're a membership organization. And us communicating to members about our positions on elections is not considered a reportable activity under the California law, right? But it's still an electioneering activity under the IRS. And so we are allowed to do it because we do it out of our C4 entity, but it's not something that C3s can do, even if you have members. And it's the IRS who assesses what an activity is prohibited, what political activity is prohibited based on the totality of circumstances. Some activities that are always considered political activities are communications that express the advocacy of the election of a candidate or political party, endorsements of a candidate, contributions to a candidate, political party, or political action committee. Voter registration activities that are conducted on a partisan basis. For example, if you're saying, I am registering voters for this political party, then that is not 501c3 permissible. However, the other side of that is if it's just I'm registering voters and there's no partisanship to it, then you are allowed to do registration. So activities that 501c3s can do in voter education, nonpartisan voter education that 501c3s may engage in is first, invite an elected official who is also a candidate to speak before the organization in the person's capacity as an elected official. We do this all the time. For example, our assembly members or Congress members are elected every 2 years. Essentially, they are always a candidate. They're always running for election because they have a committee open to support their reelection. So if we want to invite them to something, and we want to do an event from our C3 organization, the California Environmental Voters Education Fund, we're working with their official office. So from the position that they're elected in, so we might contact Assemblymember Addis's office and have Assemblymember Addis come speak at a conference we're hosting. Or we might contact Congressman Aguilar's office and have Congressman Aguilar come speak to a community event that we're hosting or some sort of like educational event we're hosting. And C3s are allowed to work with elected officials, but only from the capacity of the official side. So their current elected position. It can't be with their campaign. However, you can do candidate education work, and you can invite candidates to speak as long as the organization provides an equal opportunity to participate to the other candidates seeking the office. And the organization does not express support for or opposition to or favor or disfavor of one candidate or the other. An example of this is oftentimes C3s who do voter education work want to have a candidate forum. And so you want to have a candidate forum and make the candidate forum about issues around democracy and the environment, or public lands and democracy. And so you say you're doing this in a specific place or specific state or specific county, and you invite the local candidates, you invite maybe assembly members, you invite maybe federal candidates. But in order for this to legally qualify C3 is you have to invite all the candidates running for each of those positions. They don't all have to show up, but they all have to be invited. And the setup or format needs to be so that each person has equal chance to speak. And the other part about it is that you haven't expressed, or maybe say for us, like if we have our C4 organization, our C4 hasn't expressed endorsement of one candidate or another in any of the races that we're hosting the forum. So oftentimes if we want to do candidate forums, we do it before C4 does any kind of endorsement in that race, because it's an opportunity to educate the public about who's running for that seat and what their positions are, so long as the format is a fair format. I see a hand from, is it Janet? Do you have a hand?
Yeah, so what if you have two candidates and one doesn't come and one does? Can you still do it?
Yes, as long as you can show that you invited both of them and you made a fair attempt to get both of them there.
I think Corinne also has
great.
a question.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. My source of funding is federal, and my fiscal agent is 501c3. They were instrumental in getting the soda tax passed. I was asked recently to endorse the extension of the soda tax. Permissible or not permissible?
So two things that I would say here. The soda tax is a policy, so it's not related to an election, right? Or is it a
Okay.
ballot measure? That's something people
It's a
vote on?
ballot measure.
Okay, so it's still considered policy. And so
Okay.
as a C3, you can express support for that if that is aligned with you. However, because of your grant funding being from the federal government, I would check the grant rules about using that source of funding for that activity. If you have non-discretionary funds or funds that are just general operating funds that aren't committed from, say, the federal government, then I feel a lot more comfortable saying you're probably fine. But because the source of your grants are federal grants, I would say check the rules before you do that.
Yeah, well, supposedly you cannot do that. And I
Yeah,
was just
so that's
wondering
my
if
guess
an
too.
endorsement is the same as lobbying.
Yes, it is. You're
Okay,
communicating
great.
a position. Yeah. And
Okay.
because once you share that publicly, any voter
Mhm.
can see that, and the voters are the legislators in that case.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Rosalind.
Thank you. And just to follow up to that question, we are fiscally sponsored by another organization that has many projects who probably have different kinds of funding. So how do those rules apply when there's that variance between federal and state grants?
That's
funding?
fun. That's a fun question. My first plan or my first act would be just check with your fiscal sponsor and see what they say and what their lawyers say. My guess is they have lawyers on retainer to help with these kinds of questions. However, because this fiscal sponsor probably has a lot of projects, it probably changes the limits for your organization itself, because there is a organization, the Tides Foundation here in California. I don't know if they're everywhere, but I'm familiar with them in California, and they sponsor a lot of projects. And because they sponsor a lot of projects, the overall organization budget is so big. And because you're a project of them, or say if you're a project of Tides, the limits on what you can do lobbying for the organization that was a part of that was fiscally sponsored by them was a lot higher, because it went to the overall Tides budget versus just our individual budget as a project of Tides. And so that's something, again, you want to check with them and their lawyers, whoever your fiscal sponsor is, to get clarity on and specifics.
Yeah, can I just add on to that? Matt's totally right. Talk to your fiscal sponsor about that, because they probably have like very specific rules about what you can do around lobbying. Because essentially, whatever lobbying you do is their lobbying.
Exactly.
So you are an extension of their organization and their nonprofit. And so your lobbying has to be counted towards either their insubstantial amount of lobbying, or if they've elected I'm never going to get it right, the 501H, whatever it is,
yeah.
then whatever the amount maximum they have there. And like Matt is saying, if they're a really big organization, like 15% of their operations might be a huge amount of money. So you could do a ton of lobbying and they're not doing any lobbying and it doesn't hit their cap and they may not care. But my understanding is they like to track that stuff and be very clear with your fiscal sponsor if you are trying to engage in any lobbying activity, because they're going to want to know about it.
Exactly. Thank you, Aurora. That beautifully said. All right. Last 2 points on what you can do as a C3 organization with elections. One other point is produce and distribute nonpartisan voter guides. As long as the guide addresses a broad range of issues of interest to the public, so it can't just be limited, just on the environment or just on this, right? It has to be a broad range of issues, and the organization provides all candidates with the opportunity to respond. So you can put candidates on there or all sides of that to respond, and the guide doesn't favor or disfavor any positions of one or the other. And so it's completely nonpartisan. You're allowed to put out voter guides as a C3. Voter guides are important and they play an important role, because so many times the barrier for people to voting is like, I don't know what's on the ballot. And so organizations that are community organizations, grassroots organizations that can serve as an educator to voters that is outside of the parties or the candidates, just somebody that they see as unbiased, is so important to just getting people the information they need to make a decision to vote. So it is possible to do this. Again, any kind of materials you produce, I highly recommend having a lawyer review it. We have our lawyers check all of our materials before we put them out publicly. And then the last point is here, something else that C3s are allowed to do with regards to elections is voter registration and get out the vote activities. As long as you're not supporting or opposing candidates or political parties, and you're not targeting voters based on parties, then you're allowed to just do get out the vote work. Something that we've done a lot of out of our C3 organization is programs that text and knock on doors for young voters, because young voters historically have not turned out to vote at high numbers in elections. And we want to encourage young voters to vote more, so we have a stronger democracy and encourage, build up people who are turning out to vote. We're targeting voters, right? We have a target, but it's not based off of a party. It's just based off of who's been historically not part of an election. And that's it. Any questions on engaging in elections as a 501c3? All right. Rosalind, is that a new question? Or your hand was still up?
I think just left over.
Okay, cool. That was a lot of information and a lot of me speaking at you all. I really appreciate that y'all had a lot of questions about this because it helps make it a little bit more engaging and helps, clarify what I'm saying. Just because sometimes if you hear it, it doesn't always resonate the same way. But what we're gonna do now together is we're gonna actually work on building a little cheat sheet that we can use. And what my hope is that we can fill this out enough where we can share it out to everybody to have after this training. So I'm gonna do a screen share of a Google Doc that I have. And then we're gonna work on filling it out together. Share. All right. So you all see the cheat sheet? All right. So I'm gonna crowdsource this. I'm not gonna fill this out. I want you all to help me fill this out. So if we could get a raise of hands of things that you all have taken away from this training, things that we've said, things that I've listed out that were part of the legal memo that I was reading from. What's C3 permissible, not permissible, C4 permissible, and not permissible. Really focusing on the C3 side. Obviously, that's where we're really here to learn and take away. But yeah. Take it away, y'all. Use that hand raise function, and I'll be happy to call on you to fill it into our little cheat sheet. So the question I'm asking you all, so maybe I can clarify the question a little bit, is what's something that you took away from this that is your C3 is allowed to do or not allowed to do? All right, Janet, thank you.
We can't campaign for certain candidates. Did you hear that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Rosalind.
Just the difference between lobbying and electioneering. You know the distinction.
Yeah. So understanding the distinction between lobbying and electioneering, and what would you say that is?
Lobbying is advocating for policy measures, and electioneering is for candidates and individuals. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, Gabriella.
A C3 can visit representatives for information purposes.
Can speak to and visit representatives, legislators, policymakers for educational, informational purposes. Yes. Corinne.
Let's see. We can educate the public. And by that, you're not taking sides on the issue, but just informing what the pros and cons are is acceptable.
Yeah, so long as it does not express a position on current or anticipated legislation. All right, Rosalind, is your hand? Is it you have another hand? All right, Ashley.
You can tell legislators to vote a certain way on a particular issue as long as you're within your lobbying cap.
Yes. Who else? What else? What else? And take two more, and then I'll leave it open. I'll leave the floor open for 5 minutes, or sorry, 5 minutes or so for more questions. And then the last 5 minutes, we have something else we're going to transition to. Anything else in here? Cindy.
You can attempt to influence voters on policy.
On policy, either through grassroots lobbying, so if it's policy legislators are voting on, or
Direct
for
lobbying.
ballot measures, right? In which you're direct lobbying them because they're the legislator. Perfect. Thank you, Cindy. Corinne, is that a new hand?
Yes.
Yes.
You can provide information, depending on the state, to agencies of your state. If they ask for technical support, that is acceptable. And there was something else, but it went right out my head. So
No worries.
that's it.
Yeah, and don't worry, I'm gonna take some time to fill this all in with all the different points that I spoke about too as well after, so that way we make sure this is full for everybody. All right, I'm gonna stop share for now, unless anybody has any last urging ones that we want to throw in here. All right, I'm gonna stop share. I'm gonna check out the chat, make sure there's nothing I missed. Faucia, thank you. Educate public on getting at the vote. Yes. This is an interesting question. What strategies can we implement to combat voter coercion and ensure that all voices are heard? That is, Faucia, are you able to come off of mute to explain what you mean by that? I'm not sure what your question is.
Oh yeah, sorry. I have an accent, by the way, so I hope you all understand me.
Perfect.
Yeah, so we do get out the vote and voter registration with Maine People Alliance a lot of times, but during the election, especially the national election, there's a lot of tactics that are used to fear people so they can dissuade their vote. And so I was wondering if, the larger group here, if they have any tactics for us to combat that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that is something that I think that is, I'm not sure where it lies in terms of the C3, C4 like spectrum. My guess is if you're just providing language interpretation for somebody about what's on their ballot and it's purely educational and you're providing information about it that's in a language so that you can combat kind of maybe other narratives they're hearing, but so you're giving them the facts of something, that is C3. But if there's specific messages you're trying to combat that are expressing a position, then that gets really into C4 territory is my guess. But I would talk to a lawyer about it for your specific case, because everything's case by case and also depending on where you're located.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other general questions, just from anything that we talked about today, anything that popped up for you all? All right, then the last thing we have here is How's it showing up for you all? No, I see it's not showing up as a slideshow.
I'm seeing the
Oh.
notes.
Yeah, exactly. Technology, I should see. This is the one I should have tested, Aurora. My bad.
It's all right.
But yeah, if we want to transition to talk about the evaluation form, Aurora, and what the next step is here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for this. And also, I will note that we have some time. So if people have specific questions for Matt about their own situation or about anything that came up in the training, feel free. There is still time for that. Especially all of you that already engage in lobbying to some degree. If there's particular things that have come up for your organization in that work that you'd like clarity about, please feel free to ask. But while we do that, I want us just to take a few minutes. We're going to share a quick evaluation survey in the chat. It shouldn't take more than 2 minutes. And there is a version in English and Spanish. And we just want some feedback about the training itself. This helps us improve the offerings that we have for you all and give us ideas for future trainings. So if you've got a topic that you're interested in exploring in a future training, please add that in to the survey as well. So thank you all for taking the time. And maybe I'll open it back up if anyone does have questions for Matt. Gabriella.
Yeah, I don't know if this would be included under that, but I asked our state senator to look into the possibility of an eminent domain to buy the property we're fighting for, to prevent flooding. Is that something that would be considered lobbying?
Can you say that again? So you are fighting
We're fighting now
eminent domain.
325 acres of wetland and forest to protect it because we have been terribly flooded and people have died.
And it's a
So,
legal action?
well, we were in a legal action, but that's not involved with the state senator. I just asked her if she could look into the possibility of getting eminent domain to purchase the property through the state. Eminent domain
Yeah, I'm familiar. I think if it was just a legal case, it wouldn't be considered lobbying or wouldn't be considered any kind of activity. But you're proposing a policy to a state senator, it sounds like, and that policy would then be lobbying. Like proposing the policy is considered lobbying then.
Huh, okay, thank you.
But if you wanted to show them, hey, we have this issue in our community, we want you to be aware of it, come tour this land and see what's happening here, and here's the background on what has happened, that wouldn't be lobbying.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
But you are also able to do lobbying. So that would be a very small amount of lobbying that you did, and that would be okay.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I would just note is all of what we talked about today is pretty abstract. And you don't necessarily need to do all of this. You want to stick to the things that are relevant for your organization and the mission of your organization. So if you've never done any candidate forums and you're not really engaged in, in whoever is going to be part of the city council, you don't necessarily need to dive into that. In fact, it may be not the right move for some of these things that are close to electioneering, some of those things that Matt was mentioning around supporting candidates, but they may be allowable for C3s. But they're sort of on the edge. So those are the kinds of activities that you want to be particularly mindful about how you're engaging in. And if it's sort of way out in left field for your organization, it's going to raise questions about why you're doing that.
Yeah.
So I think something to keep in the calculus as you're thinking about doing this kinds of stuff is does this fit with the overall mission of our organization? Is this in line with the kind of activities that we are trying to do and, the change we're trying to make in the world? Is it a coherent story? It's just a thought I had as we were talking about all of this.
No, absolutely, Aurora. That's absolutely right. And the history of your organization also plays a lot into how things will be perceived if a court case were ever, and prayers, knock on wood, hopefully you never get to that point. But that does play a lot into how things get interpreted in court or legally. The other thing I would say is your lawyer is never going to tell you directly, do this or don't do this. They're going to say, this is the risk involved if you do this, or this is what qualify or be compliant if in this way or that way. And you have to make a decision what's worth the risk or not. And some organizations, especially depending where you are, depending on who might not be so friendly to your organization, or might be a little bit more adversarial to your organization, you might want to just really play it safe, right? And recognize, okay, we're not going to do this kind of work because we know that people will respond in a way that will put us under different kind of scrutiny that you just want to keep your organization safe from. So kind of tying to what Aurora said, that's the other consideration you definitely want to make.
Very good point. And most of us don't have lawyers to consult, right? So you're making this calculus for yourself a lot of the time, right? You're like, pros and cons. Is it worth it to take this risk? And what are the kinds of things that I need to keep in mind as I do that to reduce the risk of doing something that I'm not allowed to or supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
Yolanda, did you have a question? I see your hands up.
I don't have a question, but I had a thought when Gabriella was speaking. You mentioned you reached out about the wetlands being, I guess, the state doing something with eminent domain, I guess, to protect it. Another idea possibly could be that has been done locally here in my city when the whole Confederate statue issue was going on. We had some statues in a public park that the city owned, and the former of someone who had a plantation that was enslaving people was buried in that park actually, and they sold the park to a nonprofit organization for $1, and then the park became private property. So may have to get some attorneys involved, but possibly if your local community, like the city or the state, owns the land, maybe you can get them to sell those wetlands to the nonprofit, and you be the manager of their property to ensure that development doesn't happen there. So you may want to do some research and speak to an attorney, but that could be an option.
Thank you, Yolanda. That's interesting to keep in mind. Unfortunately, we're all talking about private property by developers, but I will keep that in mind. Thank you.
So, well, thank you all so much. This was so great. You're going to get the slides. My contact information is in there if you have any other questions. But I'm so happy that we got to share this Friday. I was going to say Saturday. Sorry, it's because at our organization we have 4-day work week. So today is like my first day of not the regular work week. I was going to say Saturday, but happy Friday, y'all. I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for being here on your Friday off. And thank you all for joining us. Next week, we're going to do a panel discussion that I think is going to be super engaging with some grassroots activists. So we're going to really dive into like real stories from real organizations that have been winning advocacy campaigns in the state. And sometimes that takes a really long time, but it's often very helpful to hear from other people that you aren't the only ones fighting for this kind of thing. So there's going to be a lot of good information that comes out of that. And I hope to see some of you there. Yes, we will be sending the recording and the handouts, the cheat sheet, and some resources out to all of you. It may take us a week or two, but we're going to get it there, and it'll all be available on our website as well. So if you registered for the training, you will get an email that shares all of the information. So yeah, thank you all. It was really lovely to see you. I appreciate you being here and spending your Friday with us. Take care.